Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody that's hopefully made for somebody. I am your host, Kyle Naranya. Welcome to episode 1 of the show. I am very excited to be here right now. There is a lot of things to talk about, so without getting into anything specific, we're going to be covering She-Hulk episode 1, as well as the entire season of Sandman, which happened to get a second episode, or not a second, happened to get a 2-part episode the day I am recording this, and I was able to watch it just beforehand, so I am completely up to date. We're going to cover that season as a whole. Both shows are going to have non-spoiler and spoiler discussions. I shouldn't say discussions, it's just me. Reviews in general. If you don't want to have anything spoiled and just want to listen to the overview of the review, time codes will be listed in the description. So without delaying any further, let's get into episode 1 of She-Hulk. She-Hulk stars Tatiana Maslany as the titular character, Jen Walters, created by Jessica Gao, and, of course, streaming on Disney+. Now, background with She-Hulk, I have not read a single piece of media, content, video game. I have a very limited perspective when it comes to She-Hulk in general. I am aware that she breaks the fourth wall, and that her origin in the comics, without getting into specifics about the episode itself, because that would be in spoiler territory, which we are currently not. So, overview. Episode 1 aired yesterday, day of recording. If you happen to be listening to this at a later date, you can look that up. It's what the Google machine is for. So, episode 1 is a true legal comedy, and I have to say, I think the comedy really worked for me. Marvel's comedy can be really hit and miss, specifically when it comes to outright comedies. I think they've been more successful in general when it comes, or when they are doing a balance of a dramedy. I think that has been one of the most successful avenues that the MCU has been able to go down. And a strict legal comedy on paper was not something I was looking forward to, but I have to say I was thoroughly impressed with episode 1. I don't think any of the jokes were cheap, or any of the characters hamming it up really for the screen. Now, it should be said that there are 2 giant green beings in this show, which in itself is ridiculous, but I think for the most part the MCU has been able to embrace the ridiculousness and still treat it earnestly, which really does matter when you want the audience, like us, to invest in these characters. So I thought episode 1 worked out really well, without getting into overall specifics with plot details, because this is the non-spoiler section of the review. I think that episode 1 works really well as Jen's origin story. We get to know who this character is before the event, but I don't think they give us a ton to work with. We get sort of brief snapshots of what this character's life was like, and ultimately what happens that leads her to becoming She-Hulk. And that's mainly the focus of episode 1. We don't truly get to see her world outside of that. This is not a spoiler, as I feel we've seen it in the marketing materials. Jen does break the fourth wall, which, if you're unaware of what that means, it's looking through camera, the metaphysical wall, and talking directly into it. And I think Tatiana is amazing. That really shouldn't be surprising for anybody. If you've been following her career, if you are new to Tatiana Maslany, I highly recommend you check out Orphan Black. That show is incredible, and I don't want to spoil anything about it for you, but needless to say, her range is tested to an nth degree and ultimately won her an Emmy. I think she should have won 5 for each season of the show, but that's not what we're here to discuss. So I thought she was great. I think the comedy does work a lot in this show. There are some jokes that they will continually reference in episode 1 that I thought were quite funny. This did have a really good post-credit scene. I believe it's been acknowledged that every episode is going to have one. While it may not necessarily impact the overall plot of the shows, like we've kind of been... I should say this very briefly. The post-credit scenes in the films more recently have been trending in that direction. So if that's what the show is going to do, then I'm okay with it because it is just a half an hour comedy. Now, I'm not sure if threads in this are ultimately going to matter to the grand scheme of the multiverse saga, but we don't really know that yet because we've seen one episode. So I think if you are a MCU fan or a Marvel fan, or even heck, maybe you've never watched a Marvel thing and you are just a Tatiana Maslany fan, I think you should check out the episode. I tend to give a show a season or 4 or 5 episodes depending on the length. This will be a show that I will be watching back. Not watching back, we'll be continuing with, because I think they earned my laughs. I'm invested in Jen's story, and that is something that I do want to see moving forward. So with that, I think it might be time to move into spoilers. So yes, spoilers for the first episode of She-Hulk. We are given her entire origin story. They have changed how Jen ultimately is given her powers, which in the comics, very briefly, is a blood transfusion. And in this version, it happens Bruce and Jen are on a little road trip together. They are, if not first cousins, then second cousins, but they are cousins of some degree. And they are on a little road trip together, and they get into an accident, which would, at the time, appears to be a ship from, I believe it's Sakaar, from Thor Ragnarok, which is mentioned. And Jen is injured. She actually slices her arm on a car, which is pretty violent, actually, for the MCU. And I completely sidetracked myself. One of the aspects of the marketing for the show that really did drive me nuts was the inclusion of Bruce and Smart Hulk in both segments of it, even seeing him in the sling. And what was even more baffling about that was that, spoilers for Shang-Chi, I'll let you go if you haven't seen Shang-Chi. I would highly recommend it. It's, in my opinion, the best, and it's the best of the Phase 4. That's what I would have to say about that. But we saw Bruce in his arm in a sling, and obviously, if you're listening to this and you've watched all the MCU content, we know that his arm was heavily injured with having to do the snap in Endgame. And so that was confusing seeing that, and I'm glad. So Bruce has made a machine that allows him to be Bruce Banner. And the machine is damaged, which ultimately causes him to start to Hulk out, and he bleeds into Jen's wound completely by accident, because this version of the character, the writer has discussed it, don't believe Bruce would willingly do that to somebody who and give them the thing that he ultimately feels has been cursed him his whole life. And we do get to explore that in the episode. I think this was, while handled comedically, this is some of the best, almost not even, it's external monologuing from Bruce about what being the Hulk has meant to his relationship with anybody, how it's ruined them, how it's essentially given him internal and external isolation from everybody he has known and loved. And at this point, similar to most of Phase 4, our OG Avengers, well, I mean, one of them is dead, one is not dead, but is living in the past, or living in the past in another timeline. He's alone. Hawkeye's not hanging out with him. Rhodey's not hanging out with him at this. Now, that could be said that given the fact that Jen has become a She-Hulk, he doesn't want to bring anybody over because of the potential risk factors to that other Avenger. Now, that would be my explanation for it, not necessarily that the show gives us one. So yeah, so we're given all of this in the first episode, which is quite crazy. It's been brought to my attention that the drip of blood creating another monster is canonical with Incredible Hulk. That is true, and ultimately there was a version of the leader that we did not wind up getting that maybe will come up later. We're not really sure, but that's we do know we're going to be getting Abomination in this show later on, which is pretty exciting. So that is something that I am looking forward to because I like Tim Roth. I really liked Lie to Me. I thought it was a great show. Tatiana Maslany is hilarious in this show. We do get a more comedic Bruce, but I think for the most part it works because they do have great discussions about what it means to handle your emotions and how they could affect your everyday life when you can turn into this giant green rage monster. And it's been discussed a lot online with the way that Jen reacts to Bruce and how women have to deal with their emotions and the unfair expectations put on them that are not put on men. And I know that's hit a chord with a lot of people. And I think it's great. I'm not going to give my perspective on women's emotions because that's not for me to give. But a female show with female writers giving their point of view is, frankly, there's not enough of that in popular media. So for more of that, can't wait for it. I think anytime the Tatiana is breaking the fourth wall, I thought it was quite comical. Her persistence on the virginity status of Steve Rogers was quite funny. I think her tricking Bruce into revealing the status of Steve Rogers' virginity in the post-credit scene was very funny. Another comical cutting around using a curse word. And if the post-credit scenes are anything like that, then there's something that I'm going to really look forward to. But yeah, it's episode 1. We didn't get a 2-parter like we did with Obi-Wan Kenobi. We didn't get the closest premiere to this that I would have to say we've been given so far would have to be the WandaVision pilot, which also was around 20 minutes. We have been but like I said, we've been given Jen's origin story, and most of this story takes place with them in this place in Mexico that Bruce, we learn actually this is a retcon, not really a retcon, but it fills in a gap as to where Bruce was able to develop the Smart Hulk personality, which is really cool. We get to see Hulks being Hulks with no real risk to any other person, which we haven't seen before. And we do get to meet Jen's best friend, who's played by Ginger Gonzaga, Nikki Ramos. And we do briefly see Titania, who is maybe going to be the villain of the show. We're not really sure. She shows up for a second and then gets just straight up punched into the wall. Overall, I thought the She-Hulk effects look pretty good. It is something that is unfortunate that YouTube compression, because the trailers did look better on Disney Plus if you happen to watch them there. They didn't look great on YouTube, and they certainly looked worse on Twitter because Twitter's a terrible place to put videos. If you're ever watching a trailer, please don't watch it on Twitter. That's not a place to watch them if you really want to see how good they look. Watch them on the best possible screen that you have in your home, whether that's your phone, a computer or TV monitor, or I would go to YouTube, I guess. But if you have the app, and I mean, if you're listening to a review about She-Hulk, I'm assuming you have some form of place to watch this content. I would recommend watching in the best possible place because you will get the purest version of that file. But yeah, that's She-Hulk episode 1. Am I going to be watching episode 2? The answer is yes, I am going to be watching episode 2. Now, I was not planning on having to watch more of Sandman today, but lo and behold, we were given a two-story, 1-episode bonus episode of Sandman, which was really interesting. So let's hop and talk about Sandman. Now, Sandman may be one of DC/Vertigo's projects that has been in development hell forever. Maybe since 1990, after the first year that the comic came out. If you are unfamiliar with the comic, it is maybe one of the most highly regarded graphic novels of all time. There's your Watchmen's, there's your Dark Knight Returns, and typically Sandman gets thrown into that conversation. My experience with Sandman, maybe not the most unique. So the comics I never got into. They were not something that I sought out. While I still read comics to this day, but they were never comic books that I necessarily sought out. But I have been, since my kids were born, been getting into audiobooks. And so my recommendation, if you are at all curious and maybe you don't have time to hunt down all of the graphic novels, would be to check out the audiobooks, which I thoroughly have enjoyed. So Neil Gaiman directs them, or not directs them, narrates them. And it's a star-studded cast. I'm not going to go through all of them. It's been just, again, there's a lot of incredible... David Tennant, Michael Sheen, James McAvoy, the list goes on, who's been in this show. Andy Serkis, it's incredible. But, so we have the television series, which was developed by Neil Gaiman, David S. Goyer, who's made some really good things, and Alan Heinberg, and it stars Tom Sturridge as the titular Sandman. So, very briefly, Morpheus / the Sandman / Dream is one of the Endless who is in charge of the Dream Realm. And so when you dream or have nightmares, you enter his realm, which is the kingdom of the dreaming. And he is captured in the early 1900s and ultimately is released and then goes on this quest to rebuild his kingdom and regain items that have been lost, without getting into any plot details and spoilers. So I've listened to all of Act 1 of Sandman, and I loved it. The art in the graphic novels is very painterly, and characters don't seem to really stick to any particular character model, which has never been the aesthetic that I like when it comes to reading comic books. Darwin Cook is one of my favorite artists. Jim Lee, that goes without saying. I really liked, I can't remember off the top of my head. He did the first Superman, Batman, Public Enemies with Jeff Loeb. Anyways, so yes, Tom Sturridge stars as Dream. Boyd Holbrook plays the Corinthian. Patton Oswalt is Matthew the Raven. Vivian Achimpong is Lucian. Jenna Coleman is Johanna Constantine. This cast is stupid of this television show. And I loved it. So not having a concrete picture in my mind from how this show should look, I think really did me a favor, because I didn't have, this is how it looked in the comic. When listening to the audiobook, which is incredible, it was like having Neil Gaiman read me books every time I drove to work, which was incredible. I absolutely loved that. But the visual style of the comics and my own imagination was just put here on my television screen, and I was able to watch it for, I guess we're at 11 hours. And what's most interesting to me about this show is that, unlike most comic book stories, so we were talking about She-Hulk earlier, not She-Hulk specifically, but the MCU Disney Plus shows, is typically they have taken a graphic novel of sorts. Well, some of them have. I should be more specific. With Hawkeye and Miss Marvel, those were pretty close to an arc of the comic books. Hawkeye, even more specifically, was literally an adaptation to some degree of a specific run of the comic books. And Sandman fits in this unique spot where it's actually two different story arcs and 2 volumes of the comics put into one season of television, which to my knowledge doesn't really happen. Usually you may weave threads from different stories together to create your own one. Christopher Nolan did that with something like The Dark Knight Rises, which is a Batman nightmare, the Broken Bat, as well as No Man's Land, and then maybe a little bit of The Dark Knight Returns in there too. Just a little bit. But Sandman had this, what I thought was pretty a hefty goal in mind, which was to take 2 different stories that really don't have anything to do with each other and weave them together into one cohesive narrative. And I think they did that successfully. More than that, this show's fantastic. I think Tom Sturridge does a fantastic job as of Sandman / Morpheus. He's this, very rarely does he emote, but he has this cool calm about him. Other characters are always kind of on edge around him, even if he's in his own realm of the dreaming, which I thought was really, really interesting. I think everybody was cast really well. There's been some minor changes here and there because when this comic was released, it was a Vertigo comic and it was allowed to do some DC stuff. So some DC characters were in the story, but because of rights issues and for some reason this is on Netflix and not HBO Max, like HBO, this really should have been a show you made for you, especially when you're having issues with people not wanting to watch things on your HBO Max thing. But hey, maybe HBO Max would have canceled this and then the show would have been deleted off their servers and we never would have been able to watch it again. That would never happen, right, HBO Max? Oh, wait. It's happening now. Anyways, so yeah, I think there clearly have been some changes made to the stories. They even did what I didn't expect to do. There are annuals or sides, not even, one-offs, which are similar to an annual in a comic where it's just a one-off story that doesn't really have to do with the main narrative. And those were woven in really well into the whole season as a whole. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I think the show does have a truly distinct cinematography to it. Visually, it's very captivating and has this whimsical nature to it where it's like paintings. And I don't know why I said I complained about it earlier with the comics, but I think it really worked in the TV series. It was really, really cool to see specific images that they did pull, and some of the changes that they did make to the story worked really well in making it a 10-episode season as opposed to a 5-episode story and a 5-episode story, which I think would have been really jarring, especially if it felt even more like an anthology than it does already. But I think it's something to check out for sure if you are interested at all in this property. If you've seen, I honestly don't even think the trailers do it justice because they're trying to sort of pitch what this is and they can't really tell you because it's certainly a slow burn. But I watched it probably two in a row at a time and took my time with it. I did sit and watch this with my wife and she quite enjoyed it. It's almost counter content to anything that's on Disney Plus, which is great because they both scratch different itches. But I would recommend checking this out. It's doing incredibly well on Netflix. If you Google it on any of the socials, it's trending. It's been the top show and I've lost count of how many countries. We don't know yet if it's going to get a season 2, which is certainly frustrating because it does end open-ended and there is more to come. Which I'm currently actually working my way through Act 2 of the audiobooks. And there's some really interesting stuff in there that is a continuation off certain plot threads in Season 2, or Season 1. And that I'm hoping we get to, but, I mean, it's hard to tell with Netflix. I'm really hoping it's not too expensive for them to want to invest in a Season 2. But, so why did I like it? What happens in this show, Kyle? Tell me why I should watch this show. Give me the exact details. I don't care about spoilers. All right, imaginary listener, I'm going to tell you why you should watch this show. I will do it. You've been bugging me. I will do it. Here we go. Okay. So, Morpheus is trapped by one of the Lannisters, Tywin Lannister, traps him in an old glass dome. Like you do. My brain is mush right now because I am trying to remember who that is. He's a Burgess, and the character's name is driving me nuts because I cannot remember what his name is. But that Tywin Lannister. You remember Tywin Lannister? He is trying to capture Death because he wants to bring back one of his sons who died during the First World War. So yes, this show, it does start in 1916, which Charles Dance. There we go. I think I remembered who it was. Apologize for my keyboard. Yes, Charles Dance. He wants to bring back his eldest son who was lost during the World War I. and he wants to trap the Endless of Death. But he doesn't get death, he gets Dream. So Dream is trapped for 100 years. So this is one of the most interesting changes for the show. Now, I don't necessarily understand why they made the change that they did. Now, in the comic book, he is still trapped during the end of World War I, but he is released in 1989 when the comic books debuted. And that works ultimately for the length of certain character stories. But in this one, it kind of confounds the problems with the length of time. And then specifically, that's with the ages of certain characters. That's a problem with Unity Kincaid, that's a problem with Ethel Cripps, and that's a problem with John Dee. Now, the show does go out of their way, so I should explain. Ethel Cripps ultimately becomes the mother, or she sleeps with Richard Burgess, and she mothers a son, and ultimately flees for his safety because old Tywin Lannister, he's just father of the year when it comes to fiction, and gives birth to John Dee, who is played by David Thewlis, who most people would probably know as Ares, the god of war from Wonder Woman. I'm just kidding. He is Professor Lupin from the Harry Potter films, and another character that was cast perfectly. And so Dream ultimately does escape in the year 2022, so he's gone for 106 years, and as a result, nightmares from the realm have escaped, as well as dreams, and the realm of the dreaming is nothing but rubble, and has only a few of his servants have remained, being Lucien, the librarian, who's been in charge. So this is what puts Morpheus on his mission to regain his items that he's lost. He's lost his helm, being his helmet, which kind of looks like a squid mask, really, kind of. His sand, which he uses to do all sorts of stuff, and his ruby. Now, what's interesting about these items is that they are a part of him that he has put his abilities into. So he doesn't necessarily need them before he had them, but he created them, and now it's like Morpheus is walking around with a parking brake on his leg. So not ideal when you don't actually have all the stuff you're supposed to be looking for. So that the first 3 episodes of the show really do feel like an anthology series, as I mentioned earlier, where it's everything happens. We get to see the whole 100 years go by with Morpheus just being stuck in the dome, or it's not a sphere. It's like a 20-sided die made of glass, because he is. Here's one of the big changes. He is told to be put in that by the Corinthian, who's played by Boyd Holbrook, who does an incredible job. What's most interesting about this role is that an actor uses their eyes to do a lot. And because of the Corinthian's nightmarish appearance, where he doesn't have eyes, he has other mouths with just teeth. I don't know if there's lips. Now, I didn't sit super close to my TV, so I didn't really want to check that out. But we see him there, and he says, hey, maybe you should build a 20-sided glass dome or structure for this naked dude to sit in. Okay, yeah, all right, cool. And then he sort of disappears. And this is one of the areas that I thought the show was most successful, which was weaving in what is really the second story narratively through the first one. In having the Corinthian pop up, we do see bits and pieces of Desire, who's played by my brain. Sorry, I have the cast here, and I'm just trying to look at it really quickly. By Mason Alexander Park. I think they did a fantastic job with the evil deliciousness of that character. Mason absolutely killed it. And it's most interesting because you can check this out on Twitter. They got the role by messaging Neil Gaiman, and ultimately they got cast in that role. And so having the back half of the story have threads in the first half works really well. Those minor changes I thought were awesome, because when listening to this story, it was really cool to just listen to story annuals or spin-off side stories, and then the next one. But having this as one full 10-hour experience, ultimately what becomes I should say 11, because we did get a new episode. And so the first 3 we see Johanna Constantine. It is Constantine in this, because apparently that's how Neil Gaiman was told it was said. I've always been a Constantine person in terms of the pronunciation, but in this it's Constantine, and that's fine. So we see Morpheus recover the sand. He travels to Hell, where he meets Lucifer, who is played by Brienne of Tarth, also known as Gwendolyn Christie. And I like this episode a lot. I think what this show does, that is certainly something I feel like's been missing in television, is really awesome sets. They may not be gigantic, but at least we get these cool sets. So Lucifer travels to Hell and has a battle of wills. And it's essentially come up with the bigger thing. They have a battle of wills where it's come up with the bigger thing. And they just keep going, and ultimately Morpheus wins it. And this is one of the plot threads that I'm looking forward to seeing later, without getting into spoilers for what could be in season 2. But Lucifer's pissed that they lost, or that I'm actually not sure. I think the pronoun for Lucifer in this story is they, so I'm just gonna go with they for now. If I find out later on that it's not, that it's her or her, she or her, or he or him, I will correct that later on. But currently I'm going to go with they, given how the show doesn't really tell me. At least I don't believe it's outright stated. And so that is the first 3. And then we start building to ultimately the villain of the first half, which is John Dee, which in some forms is Dr. Destiny, who has the ability to control your dreams, because old John Dee, through his mother's issues, winds up with the crystal. And so 24/7 might be the episode that's talked about the most with this show, because that comic is maybe one of the most disgusting things I've ever had to listen to, because I listened to it in the Audible version, which has all kinds of sound effects of disgusting things. And reading what Neil Gaiman had to say, they did simmer some of it down because it did have to be made for TV, and this is not an X-rated or unrated. I think NC-17 specifically is what the rating would be in the United States. I live in Canada, so it would be 18A. And it's kind of disgusting, but the tension that episode specifically, so it's episode 5, is able to create is a level of uncomfortableness that I have not felt with an episode of TV in a very, very long time. And the culmination of that story is big and grand in how Dream is able to outsmart John Dee into getting him to do what he wants him to do without even knowing it, which is really cool. Getting to see a character actually grow and evolve, and given how the fact that you would think this being of eternity would never grow, or would have matured to the point where they don't feel that they have to grow or develop anymore, but ultimately does, and learns from his interactions in the modern world with humanity, which up until very recently he had decided he didn't really want anything to do with, based on past relationships he's had with humanity. And so in that, he has recovered all 3 of his items and starts putting things together, but realizes, hey, there's a couple other nightmares out there. I better figure this out. And realizes that there are 3 left. And that's where we get the story of Rose Walker, who is a dream vortex and was not supposed to be a dream vortex, but it was actually supposed to be her great-grandmother. And this is another area of the timeline change that I don't think works, because Vivian Kincaid is her great-grandmother, who was probably born in 1916. And I don't know how this timeline, I mean, so she should be like 116 or 100, maybe 100 plus, given how long Dream. So it's an area that I just try not to think about, because it just, I get lost trying to figure out exactly how this all works. So yes, so Rose Walker is a dream vortex, and what a dream vortex ultimately does is that it is a being that just starts to pull down the walls between a group of people, or it could be all of humanity's dreams. And ultimately, if you destroy the human, all of mankind or humanity's connection to the dreams, it destroys the waking world. So it destroys everything. And that's not a good thing. So Morpheus goes on his little journey to, unfortunately, kill Rose Walker, thinking that's all he can do. But in the meantime, we have the Corinthian, who is what I believe the show pitches as the creator of all serial killers. And he's just been, cultivating a group of the worst human beings you could possibly imagine. And ultimately, we get a convention of them, which, in only listening to it in the audiobook version, it was just uncomfortable. I think like 6 or 7 hours of just no thank you while listening to that and those 3 or 4 chapters. And Rose is also on her own mission to find her brother, who they were separated, unfortunately, at a divorce. And through their parallel journeys, Morpheus and Rose actually discover the remaining nightmares. And because of her love for her recently discovered great-granddaughter, Unity ultimately makes a sacrifice to keep Rose alive, and she takes the abilities of the dream vortex, because this is one of the greatest writing loopholes of the whole show, is that anything is possible in a dream, and that if you want to leave the dreaming or do anything in the dreaming, or get out of jail free card, or Deus Ex Machina, anything you can think of, you can do that because you're dreaming. There's no limits on the human imagination, or cat imagination, or dog. And the reason I mentioned cat imagination is that we get in this first half of the episode 11, we get the cat's dreams and the land of cats, which is the weirdest thing I think I've ever listened to. And there's not much to talk about that, about cats wanting to be the ultimate race of Earth and the planet. That's very strange. And then we get the story of the Muse, starring Arthur Darvill, which was, again, there's a lot of the content in the stories that Neil Gaiman tells. Like, he's not afraid to talk or write about anything. And there are a lot of issues, mental health, rape, the mistreatment of you name it, he discusses. And it's certainly something to think about. Like, the level of intellect on this guy is, I'm doing a bad job because I'm just, like I said, I'm a complete nobody. But I think it's a good epilogue to the show, because it does ultimately show how Morpheus has grown through the 11 episodes we've witnessed. And so we do have threads. We do see in almost a post-credit scene of episode 10, Lucifer's like, I'm not having it. I don't like that I lost. So that is threads that I'm looking forward to seeing them explore in season 2. I do hope within the month we do get an acknowledgement of season 2 coming to an end. I really dug Sandman. I think if you are looking for something that scratches that mature Netflix itch that the Netflix Marvel shows used to do, maybe even if you're a Stranger Things fan, this is covering similar ground in terms of maturity of storytelling. I think that would be something you should really check out. But yeah, those are the 2 shows to talk about right now. So moving forward, here's the schedule that I'm sort of planning with the show. If there is content, usually from one of the major streaming services, likely Disney Plus, I'm going to try and have an episode out live, if I am streaming it, on the Friday. And if there is a big blockbuster coming up, that's going to pivot to Monday to give, if you want to listen to the spoiler discussion moving forward, those episodes are going to be done on Monday. and hopefully be out by Tuesday morning. That is ultimately the goal. This is a true one-man show, one-person show in any and all avenues. I'm hosting the stream. I'm running it on my own. And I really enjoyed this, and I hope you did as well. So if you are somebody that enjoyed this podcast from a nobody, please follow on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/filmrealists. The show will be available in the very near future on Apple and Spotify. Currently, the hosting is Anchor. The link tree, if you're looking for all of the different socials for the show, is connected to all the different versions. So Film Realists on Twitter, Film Realists on Instagram. That will be where I will announce what is coming up in the future episodes. If you have any questions, fan questions that want to be covered, you can tweet me at Kyle_Naranja. That's KYLE_NORONHA. Happy to cover them. I've already got one that I'm looking forward to covering for next week, because next week's episode will be a slimmer week because it will be She-Hulk episode 2. And you know what? Maybe some end of the summer recommendations. That might be what I do in episode 2. I'm not going to promise that that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say it's a big maybe on the recommendations if we have time. I feel like there may be time for it, but I am looking forward to discussing the first fan question, and I even have one for week 3 already. So if you enjoyed the show, that's where you can find me. I'll see you next time.